Thank you for participating in the 9th Annual BlackStar Film Festival. We would like to thank our funders and individual donors, as well as our network of producing and community partners. This panel is supported in part by Firelight Media. The runtime for this panel is 60 minutes, including audience Q&A, so please leave your questions in the comments and we'll do our best to engage them. Please follow us on all social media platforms at BlackStarFest and use the hashtags BSFF20 and BlackStar20SoLit. We hope you have a wonderful time during the 2020 BlackStar Film Festival.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this panel, Solidarity is Not a Trend nor a Market Exchange, which calls upon Robin D.G. Kelly's invocation that within racial capitalism, our radical political accompliceship is not a discrete commodity available for purchase. I'm Farah, the panel producer, and it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Sonya Childress, who is an LA-based documentary impact producer, cultural strategist, and filmmaker cheerleader. She has positioned films to fuel narrative shifts and support social justice organizing for over 2 decades. Most recently, with Firelight Media, she's engaged in field-building writing and works as a senior fellow with the Perspective Fund.
Thank you, Farah, for the introduction. Greetings, welcome, and I hope everyone is doing well and healthy and safe this morning and afternoon. As Farah said, my name is Sonya Childress, and my pronouns are she, her, and I am based in Tongva land, which is known as Los Angeles, occupied land built on stolen labor. And I'm, really, really excited to have this conversation with people who I consider to be trailblazers, change agents, my co-conspirators in this incredible moment, this incredible transformational moment that's happening politically and socially within our field and in our world. So I'm really fired up and excited about this conversation, and I hope that it is generative for all of us participating and for all of you listening in and hopefully participating in the chat. So thanks for joining us this morning and afternoon, and then we'll jump right into what I hope will be a really good conversation for all of us. We are really thrilled to have Marcia Smith, who's the president and co-founder of Firelight Media, which is dedicated to supporting documentary filmmakers of color and supporting their careers and their work. She's also the co-founder of Firelight Films, which is Stanley Nelson's production company. She's also a writer and artist working to plumb Black collective memory. Welcome, Marcia. We also welcome Bhawin. Bhawin is an educator, filmmaker, and co-founder of Youth FX, which is focused on empowering young people of color through the power of filmmaking and digital media. He's also the co-director of NextDoc, a fellowship program and collective that exists to amplify the voices of the next generation of documentary filmmakers of color. Bhawin is currently in post-production on his own film, Out of the Muck, a feature-length documentary he's co-directing with Ira McKinley. Welcome, Bhawin. Next up, we have Jemma Desai. Jemma is a born and bred Londoner, currently reconsidering her work biography after spending the last year looking straight into the void of institutional life. We have been there, Jemma. She is currently a researcher and writer, sometimes talks about her feelings in public, and it used to have a film programming practice she hopes to reimagine in a better future. Welcome, Jemma. And finally, we welcome my main man, Ben Alex Dupris, who's a filmmaker and impact producer working within the paradigm of North American Indigenous storytelling, art, and activism. He's an enrolled member of the Colville Tribes in Washington State and operates alongside many BIPOC known deviants who could be called renegades of funk. Bring the funk, Ben Alex. Okay, wonderful. Welcome, good people. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Wonderful to see your beautiful faces.
Everybody.
Let's hop right into it. So before diving into what solidarity among Black, Indigenous, people of color artists looks like today, and our freedom dreams of what it can become. Let's talk about what it is not. Jemma, your piece, your shot heard round the world, which is entitled "This Work Isn't for Us," which is your embodied autoethnography, begins with a quote from Dr. Angela Davis. I'm just going to read it really quickly. The quote says, "I have a hard time accepting diversity as a synonym for justice. Diversity is a corporate strategy. It's a strategy designed to ensure that the institution functions in the same way that it functioned before, except now you have some Black faces and brown faces. It's a difference that doesn't make a difference." Dr. Angela Davis. So talk to us, Jemma, about how the language of diversity, inclusion, and even solidarity has been co-opted and weaponized to appease and silence artists of color. Want to get us started there? You may be muted.
Thank you so much for getting us started, and thank you so much to BlackStar. And I'd like this question, I feel like a lot of responsibility towards setting up, right? Because answering this kind of question, it's really hard not to center whiteness. And this is something that we've all kind of talked about, like before, about how this conversation here at a place like BlackStar, regardless of whether we're online or in person, we don't want to do that. And that is what diversity and inclusion and the language of it requires us to do. And so to say that, as you mentioned, like I've written this paper, and if people are really interested in a kind of quite UK centered, but like detailed dissection of how diversity policy and language like relates to the way that the state functions, and in arts and culture, like it's available. But like here, I kind of just want to talk about how this language like brings us really far from true like liberation and freedom. And part of that, the reason is like because, as Angela Davis says, right, it's like the logic of them is like completely contorted. So when we look at this term like BIPOC, which is a political term of like solidarity, and people start saying, like organizations start saying, we want to increase like BIPOC representation. What they're saying when they say that is that we want things that are additional to what we already have. And then like I think it's really important to just like think about what words actually mean. So what does it mean to say Indigenous people are additional? And when we think about it like that, it means that like in this context, like literally words like have no meaning. What does it mean to like call a single person diverse, or even a group of people diverse? Like who gets to decide like who is different, and how much difference is enough, right? And how can organizations say that we are inclusive, or we strive to be inclusive, without ever talking about the ways that like we have and do exclude, or how organizations have and do exclude? And then when we like start participating in like these language games, like these really important other things start to happen, which is that people that are most proximate to whiteness, or like whatever is most like palatable, are the people that become most visible and powerful in those spaces, right? So in that set of circumstances where there's like a hierarchy of palatability and words really don't have any meaning, I just wonder how we can account for this moment of like reckoning, like which is rooted in Black liberation, right? This isn't Diversity Week. This is Black Lives Matter. And so how can we like rely on languages and schemes and structures which are set up for organizations to say that they care about diversity, not hire even one Black person and still say that they are diverse, right? Like that these are all the things that this language allows us to do. So for me, like this language has proved itself completely antithetical to Black liberation, which means that it's completely antithetical to all of our liberations. And we need to do away with it.
Yeah, I mean, I love, even just that one piece, which is, organizations cannot frame their work or respond to this moment by making these gestures of inclusion without first acknowledging and repairing how they were exclusive. And what we don't see that in our field. There is not a general acknowledgement yet and a repair strategy around the historical exclusion of communities of color. There's just a sort of, now we're going to include you all. And I think that's really brilliant, all of it, Jemma. Do other folks want to jump in? Marcia?
Yeah, I would just say, we made a decision as an organization a couple of years ago that we were not going to participate in discussions at industry events that were about diversity. We just weren't going to do it because that framing did not feel like ours. It was not a subject that we thought we wanted to discuss. And so, our approach to that was to just say, actually, we're not going to invest in that. We're not going to spend our time and our energy trying to, engage in a discussions that were shaped around a language that we rejected. And, there were times when the language came straight up against language that we proposed that was about, not just us, but a lot of filmmakers of color proposed that was about decolonization, right? And so when I think our part of the field developed that language, which I know is problematic in other ways, that was an occasion for us to actually say, we're just not gonna participate in that, which I would just put out there as one approach.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I would just add that I think, yeah, I mean, one of the things I've just been thinking a lot about, and I loved your work, Jemma, when I started reading a lot of the work that you had written around this topic, and I think it totally applies to what's happening here. And I think one of the things that's just kind of fascinating and disturbing is that in this particular moment, when you're absolutely right, the focus is on Black liberation, it feels like organizations are trying to think about how can we internally become better white people and sort of like look at ourselves. So it's like this massive like group therapy starts happening, and it's like, oh, we're embarking on this 3-year plan to investigate diversity, this and that. And it's like, how about you start embarking on a plan to start actually like giving back, resources and that don't belong to you, that have been sort of taken away from communities of color and sort of used as a way to build up your brand and your entity because you're sort of using the language of diversity, when actually tangibly the structures within your organization are not affected or changed. But you make these statements, or like, there's like the painting of the streets, of Black Lives Matter on the streets. Like a lot of that is like, it's sort of like this appeasement, but it's actually this really kind of disturbing like look at like white psychology, in the sense that like you want to make yourself a better white person to make you feel better about the circumstances that you're sort of finding yourself in, when as an institution, it's like you're not looking at the structures within. It's like, for me, it's like any organization that before, this George Floyd uprising did not have any staff that were people of color. It's like, I don't even want to have a conversation about it, because it's like, you clearly didn't care. I was saying to someone, there's this thing called the Wayback Machine, which is an archive of websites from, years. It's like, you can look back. I can look back last year and see what you were actually talking about, because you weren't talking about Black Lives Matter last year, but it took the death, it took the massive uprising, and basically, honestly, it took the fear of you might having your institution being burned people that have had been in this struggle and this fight for a long time, rather than sort of being somebody. And I think, Jemma, you said it so well. It's like, myself as a non-Black person, as a person of color, like I find myself trying in situations where people want me to do that and like be a proxy for that conversation. And I'm just like, I'm not a Black person. Me being a person of color who's of South Asian descent does not give me the right to speak on those issues. I'm going to be an accomplice, and I'm going to be in that struggle and fight for Black liberation through the work that I'm doing. But I'm not going to be a proxy for that conversation. I'm not going to let you off the hook as a South Asian person to have this conversation be sort of like basically flattened into this diversity conversation. So it's like we have to kind of get real in this particular moment, because there has been harm done by this institutional sort of avoidance of dealing with the core issue.
Yeah, I mean, I think, we think about the parallel justice movements that should be informing this moment of transformation in our media industry, and you think, well, what are the parallel justice movements that are moving us forward, right? There's sovereignty, land sovereignty movements, the reparations movements. Well, so what does narrative sovereignty look like? If we can acknowledge that stories have been told, institutions have been built, all in service of white supremacy, basically, then what does reparations look like for that? How do you repair that then? What is, if stories have been told about folks of color, then what is narrative sovereignty look like? What should it look like institutionally, not like emotionally, but like what should it look like institutionally? We should be thinking about how these justice movements should be should inform what we're asking for, what we are demanding, what we are asking of institutions who are going through this moment of transformation and thinking of these things in very, like, well, we don't even know what the solutions are. There's no models out there. They're justice models out there. And all we have to do is borrow the framework of justice models and incorporate it into this field. It's sovereignty, it's reparations, and then we level a playing field and we start over. But without that process, you can't skip ahead to repair something without acknowledging the repair. And I think that's why, Jemma, you talk about being trolled by diversity initiatives. It feels like trolling because we've skipped a step. We're trying to make it all better without really acknowledging the harm. Right. So to me, it feels like, I think that's part of why this stuff feels so not just superficial, but like violent sometimes. So are we okay starting the conversation and now decentering with kind of what we don't want to see, and now decentering the white gaze and talking about us for a bit?
Mm-hmm.
Let's put the mirror in front of ourselves now. This is the fun part. Okay, enough, Jack. Okay, next. Bhawin. So as you know, as filmmakers of color, and you and I are engaged on a lot of work, as filmmakers of color and folks in our field are really balancing the need to do this work of holding historically white institutions accountable, this field accountable. We're doing all this culture shift labor, and we're balancing the need to do that kind of corrective work with the desire to build power within and across communities of color and establish new forms, new languages for our work, new centers of gravity, right? So how do we approach this work that you're talking about around divesting our energy, our stories, our resources, whatever it is, from the institutions and industry norms that often tokenize and marginalize us, that commodify our stories, right? How do we divest from these institutions? And then what are we looking towards? Are we, can we find liberation in building parallel power structures and gatekeepers, or are we looking for something else?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I mean, this is something that, like, this is the work that we're doing here at YouthFX and NextDoc. And I think I get started with that conversation about, like, why isn't there this? And why aren't there more opportunities for us? And we decided 12 years ago, we need to create the opportunities for ourselves, because if these institutions wanted us to have, positionality where we had the access to tell our own stories, then that would have happened already. And I think, like, I'm all about, the ethos at YouthFX is, it's not no, it's how, right? It's like, if you have ideas, like, we're trying to figure out how to make them happen, and I think that, there's this incredible play that, my co-director Darian Henry put me onto earlier this year, called Day of Absence by Douglas Turner Ward, and the whole premise of the play is that, all the black people disappear from this town and the white people start to freak out. And I start thinking about, like, when you think about arts and culture, and, like, in all realms, it's like, imagine a world with no people of color making art. You know what I'm saying? I mean, this is a bland world, right? So we have to step into our power. We are the creative force that's driving culture, that's making change. And I think it's so important for us to step into that power. And I think it's important for us to manage our energy. It's like, I don't want to sit on panels. Like, this is the type of shit I want to be into. Like, this panel right here, it's like, I want to talk to us, because I think we spend a lot of time, like, speaking for, sort of like the larger realm of BIPOC people in these spaces. And so, and it's important for us as an organization, I think for everybody, to look to the past and also dream of our desired future. So it's like, look at the institutions, look at the people that have been trailblazers in the past, recognize them, learn from them, read their books, watch their films, and then think about like, how do I kind of like catalyze that information into who I am in this present moment, and then speak into existence a desired future. And I think part of that involves us doing some deep, conversation and community building. And I think for us too, it's about defining these terms of solidarity and what does that mean to have solidarity? Because to me, it's like, I'm not here to like sort of like cancel and divest of every single institution, because there's definitely white institutions that are trying to support us, but it's got to be on our terms. You know what I'm saying? Like, it can't be these little handouts and these little, sort of like panels and these invitations to a conversation, because in essence, a lot of that ends up being free labor for us, and we have to continue to do that work. So like, I'm super interested and excited about this particular moment, because what I think is the potential here is like, I'm seeing like all these different collectives growing and starting to happen. And like, part of what I think is, this is like sort of like the groundwork, the foundational work of tilling the soil. Like, we're not even planting the seeds yet. We're just tilling that soil, getting that soil ready, because we need a whole new, sort of like space for us to grow. Like, we can't grow out of this white sort of dominated space. We need to grow out of our own space. So we need to start tilling that soil right now. And man, we have so much talent. Like, we have everything we need, as a community, and we have all the connections, and we have to just build these structures and trust in that future. And I have to say, like, one important component of this is we have to involve young people, and we have to have young people in positions of power. I hope people got a chance to catch the Next Doc panel a couple of days ago, because I was just so inspired and blown away, because young folks are speaking with an unapologetic perspective. Like, they're not tied to these old ways of doing things, and they're demanding shit to be changed. They're burning stuff down. They're taken to the streets in a different way. You know what I mean? And I think we have to involve them in these conversations and give them positions of power, because at the end of the day, like, we ourselves, and I'm speaking for myself, I'm 46 years old, like, I need to be held accountable. You know what I mean? And I think, speaking of that particular framework, it's like, accountability has to be built in from the ground. It cannot be something that happens because someone calls you out or because this thing happens. Like, frameworks of accountability have to be built into your institutions and our new organizations, because we have to remember, accountability is justice work, right? So it's like, when you hold me accountable, you're seeking justice, and if I don't have a framework for you to step into my organization or our collective or our organization and our space that's already there, then I'm not creating a safe space, and I have to acknowledge all the different ways that those kind of like harms have been done in the past and learn from that, and we're not perfect. We're going to make mistakes left and right, but experimentation is so important. And I think it's really like an exciting time because that experimentation is happening. And I hope people with the resources are giving that up. I told people, I said, look, if you go to these rallies and these panels and these conversations, when someone starts talking about reparations and you see all the white people that are clapping, right? Take note of all those white people. Walk up to them and say, can you write me a check? You know what I'm saying? Because you're clapping when someone said reparations. Well, I need some. I need to kick off my collective. You know what I'm saying? And start with 2-3 of you who want to make art, who want to create something, and ask, what you need of the organizations that are in your community that look like you, first and foremost. And I have to just say, last thing is that YouthFX has really grown because of NextDoc and had this really national, platform, which I'm so excited about. And it's really about giving young folks the voice to determine their futures. But at the same time, like, this moment of pandemic and sort of pause has really given us a chance to also remember to be rooted in your community that you're around, that your location, where are you based, and how are you accountable, and how are you supporting that community. So as filmmakers, yes, we have all these films that we're working on, these bigger, projects, but how are we supporting what's happening on the ground as an institution to the people that look like us? Because at the end of the day, it's like, I don't care if I make it to Sundance, if the dude around the block doesn't know who the hell I am and doesn't have any sort of relationship with me, because what's the point? You know what I mean? So it's like, it's really important for me to believe that we have everything that we need, and that the future is really up for grabs right now. And I think like the talent that is out there is really incredible. So I'm really inspired right now. And I want to also, shout out places like Third World Newsreel and Blackside and, Firelight, because the groundwork has been laid, and now it's up to us to sort of take it to the next level.
Well, what I love about that, Bhawin, is this idea that, like, we in this moment of transformation where you said, like, we're tilling the soil to
Right.
even just to start planting the seeds, right? That in our kind of freedom dreams, as we consider how nonfiction can be a tool, not just of a colonial gaze, but like a liberatory tool, a liberatory practice, that we can't consider artistic liberation if the community around us are struggling, and we are like, we're talking about our artistic creative, freedom in a way that's, disconnected from the material reality of our own community. And I know, Ben Alex, your work is really rooted in community. Do you want to jump in there on this topic?
Yeah, I'm very, very inspired by, what you're saying and the conversation and the flow of this idea of centering the solidarity of all of our different movements. My approach to filmmaking comes from past of being more involved in what was more a pop cultural base, the music, the club scenes, the community gatherings. My perspective on what was active, was formed from the political movements that I was born into, like Wounded Knee and, some of these other big indigenous movements, but also of the pop culture of the 80s. You look at some of the foundational, movies in hip hop and some of the songs and you're talking about, a sense of like this, this creation of something that's supposed to bring us all together and rise up from the streets and come together as people, and it being picked off early on by the white gaze, by white supremacy as a commodity to be sold and shaped in their own narrative to Midwestern people. So there's generations upon generations, and this has gone back for hundreds of years. And we are talking about, the media being how from which the youth of this day considers their history now. They're not reading as many books as they're interpreting the world through social media and filmmaking. I am one of those lost youth that never got spoken to. I am in my middle age coming into filmmaking as almost like kicking and screaming, because I prefer to be in person and I prefer to be in the movements themselves, whether it's in Seattle or New York, underground dance scenes, or, LA, and just seeing how, the thoughts and the creative process was always off camera, because that's where you knew you were in the middle of something that was brewing, that would hit the streets and be powerful on its own. Now we're amplifying all of these pop cultural elements in real time online or through our work. And so I have no choice but to step forward in the last 4 years and say, listen, it's time for us to acknowledge, a little bit of the history of how this has all come about. And I know that, what we're doing and talking about the youth haven't been able to have access to this, because the institutions that have built the narrative for, BIPOC, filmmakers or creatives is centered around them feeling good about themselves and not us feeling good about ourselves. And, so we're all kind of in this washout, this wave, and hopefully in the near future, those of us who have felt excluded from, the status quo will begin to, find a way to blend all of our experiences together so that our youth can step forward and have first access. It doesn't matter if they're educated, doesn't matter if they've done something wrong. Do they have a felony on the record? Did they end up getting in a fight with somebody who was important? Did they, all of these issues and scenarios become political. And when you politicize art and you politicize film, you're saying that you're going to put a collar around it and you're going to own it for yourself, and you're going to decide who gets to be important. And I'm here to say, like, I'm here to support any filmmakers, any artists that can step forward and show me the energy, that synergy of the streets, and the ability to step forward and tell their story in a way that affects their communities first. So we're dealing with Turtle Island as North American continent, is going through its massive apocalypse. It's not new what's happening to America. We're just now getting to the point where we're willing to admit it. Anyone?
Anyone? Jemma, Marcia, want to jump in on that?
Yeah, oh, sorry. Yeah, I just wanted to just amplify the idea of kind of moving out from your location. So this idea about like giving like young people power, which is such a like important and simple idea that is so obvious. But so incredibly potent and powerful. Like that is where the transformation will happen the quickest. And I think this idea of having meaning to like what is located to you closest, like your community, but like, you know, just physical location is something that like is lost in these spaces because they are like based on colonial logic, which is extractive and not about the land, right? And I think all of these ideas are really being like deeply understood and enacted by young people because actually they don't really have access to institutions. And I'm seeing that a lot in the UK, is just like there are people who aren't even entering institutions like universities or film schools. They're just doing their own thing. And that is the most interesting stuff that is happening. And that is where I think the deep knowledge is.
Yeah. I mean, I think that is the future. The future is stepping way back. You know, I mean, I think, you know, you can't talk about, you can't build, you know, just like Bhawin, you're saying, you can't build on a foundation that wasn't meant for our, you know, to represent our stories, to funnel and cultivate our freedom. And so if you're creating something new, it has to be rooted somewhere. And I think this idea that we're so, you know, the field has been built on this colonial gaze, on the adventurer, auteur who gets to travel to these exotic locales. And there's this sense that place-based filmmaking is like elementary, like you start there and then you really make films, you know, and as if there's something, um, you know, simple about being rooted in a place, being accountable to that place, being in relationship to the community in that place. And that is like where not only it starts, but that's where movements are built. That's where power is built in community, and that's where you are in relationship to both young people and elders. And I feel like this forward movement we're making is going to require all of us to take big steps backward and root ourselves and speak from a very rooted place, in a way that I think BIPOC artists aren't necessarily all operating from. But I love that you all invoked both young people and our elders, and I want to talk a little bit about the legacy that we're standing on. You know, we know that in the 1960s and 70s, at least in North America, right, the civil rights and then the global independence movements really created an explosion of media collectives. You know, as in that moment of transformation, the idea that media could be a liberatory form was like urgent. And you know, a number of collectives sprang up here in the United States, like LA Film Rebellion here in Los Angeles, the Third World Newsreel, which is still going today, Black Side, Henry Hampton's outfit, which produced Eyes on the Prize, right? Visual Communications, which is still thriving today. And many of the artists and filmmakers who came from those collectives have become, to us, mentors, our teachers, gate openers, not gatekeepers, right? And I think sometimes you hear me now? Yes. So as artists from those collectives became mentors and educators for our generation, oftentimes now when we think about this transformative work we're in the midst of now, we don't often acknowledge the legacy of the work that happened before us. And I think sometimes we can adopt an ahistorical analysis about both the opportunities and the challenges ahead of us. So, Marcia, I'd love you to jump in here about what lessons we might be able to take from some of that pioneering work, from the organizations that were built in the 60s and 70s. You know, what lessons can we learn from them about the power of representational politics and the pitfalls of representational politics, the power of cross-racial coalition building, institution building? What lessons might we learn from that legacy? And then what responsibility do organizations today, like Firelight, have in kind of canonizing and building on this body of work?
Thank you, Sonya, and thanks to BlackStar for this incredible panel and conversation. I should say first, I am sitting on Wampanoag lands on the island of Martha's Vineyard. So, I mean, I think, when I think about the set of organizations that was created, really in relationship to the growth of liberation movements in the 60s and 70s, there is a parallel now. These were formations that started out as really tied to social movements, really were places where people had discussions and debates about what solidarity meant across racial lines. There were a lot of spaces that were created by people of color, and they had a relationship to the movement. I think that was really important in all the groups that you named, in all the groups that arose as part of the Black arts movement. I mean, I think, and you see this going back as well, that artists of color have always had a relationship to their communities and to liberation movements that is different from what white artists and filmmakers have had. And therefore, I think we have always felt a different sense of responsibility and accountability and connection to those communities. And I think that is still true. And, I am really heartened by the flowering that I think is happening now as people are again, inspired by and connected to those movements, are developing new collectives and new formations, some formal, some less formal. Some of those will become more formal in the coming years. Some of them may decide they want to stay informal, and I think that's good. I think we need all kinds of different types of formations. And again, I think you're right. If we look at where people come into our field from, they don't come from film school by and large. We don't get to go to film school. We don't get to go to art school. We don't, we come up through being essentially apprenticed to someone who can hire us on a project, or we teach ourselves, or we hop over from doing something else, or we understand narrative, we understand story, and we decide to kind of take that leap. And I think that's going to continue to happen. I think it's really important that we pay attention to those organizations that play that role on a local level, a regional level, because I'm concerned that if we look at the impact of COVID over the next 10 years, that's going to have a severe effect. Because, there's a lot of unfinished business, I think, that, though some of those groups are still taking up, and other groups that are around now are taking up, including the kind of general lack of sustainability of our field. And, here again, filmmakers of color are the miner's canary. We are the most unstable financially, but, one of the things that we don't talk about is how this industry that we operate in takes advantage of freelance labor. We who produce the work that ends up driving the streamers, drives the festivals, drives this kind of ecosystem that is increasingly a commercial ecosystem, that we who produce that content are ourselves very vulnerable financially. We're talking about people who put their whole lives into the work. They don't have health insurance. They, as I say, don't have retirement plans. So we work on a fragile. We are the most fragile piece of an economy that, for other people, actually produces a fair amount of profit. And I think that is one of the big things that is different from when a third world newsreel was started. That's the one I know the best. And I would say even today, they bring young people into our field in a way that the film schools will probably never be able to do. So those organizations are critically important for the future. Other thing I just want to say is I think I think there's definitely a recovery project that we working today need to do. we often talk about the whole field of documentary film as being inherently colonial, inherently based on the white gaze. I think there's another history, and that we need to recover that. We need to honor that, celebrate that. And I don't know the archive very well, but I know that there is one. So the two things that come to my mind when I think about that are Thurgood Marshall in the early 1950s or late 40s taking a film camera to the South so that he could document the conditions of schools for African Americans in the South, and thereby show how they were different, how they were systematically, dispossessed of resources. And he was using a camera in order to make a case, right? The other thing that comes to mind is, and I just saw this again recently, and part of it is in a film that we did on African American businesses. These Black towns that grew up in the West, there was at least one pastor who had a film camera and who documented Black life in the town of, I think, Boley, Oklahoma, or some other Black town in Oklahoma. And it's extraordinary footage because he was just documenting community life at this time in this place where Black people built a society that was intended to kind of allow them to live. So they had a vision of liberation. As we are carrying now too. They had this. They documented that and what that meant for them in the 1920s. And I say all this to say I think part of learning from history is learning from these organizations and the vision that they had, which I think is actually very similar. It was a very radical vision, the groups that arose in the 60s and 70s. But part of it is going back even before that and recovering a documentary archive that we have produced ourselves as well, and that we can use to build on as we look to develop our own imaginations for what the future could be.
I mean, I appreciate that history lesson, that offering, Marcia, because I think so. I mean, I've framed this work as, this field as inherently colonial. And I know to be true that I was inspired by Zora Neale Hurston's films, the movies that she took as she traveled through the South and as she traveled through the Caribbean. And that work is like, we love looking at ourselves. We all love the mirror. We all love the mirror. We're cute as hell. Like, why wouldn't we have, as soon as the camera was invented, we turned it on ourselves.
And that's our legacy.
And yet, and that is our legacy. And I think, again, when I talk about how we can oftentimes have an ahistorical, both analysis and ahistorical understanding of this field, of the history of this field, it is because of how we have been miseducated about this, about the practice of filmmaking, about the history of filmmaking. And I often think when we think about the institutions that are bringing folks of color into the field, I feel like a gap there is, we need our own film schools. We need our own places where this knowledge is, archived and taught. And this perspective, this relationship to the moving image, this relationship to our own communities is like the foundation that this new generation is being taught, and how do we do that? How do we become the people who center and recover our own canon? How do we do that institutionally? Anyone want to jump in there?
I mean, I'll just say that I think it's really important for us to call to task academia, and academic institutions have also sort of walled off, these archives as well. And I think that's something that's really important for us to call out, because I think, I remember a conversation with Ashley Clark at BAM, programming the spook who sat beside the door. And he's like, there's literally 3 actual reels of that film left, and so it's like, you have to dig around, and then it's like, you have all these archives and these universities and they're just holding stuff. And sometimes they just end up in these, basements, and the films are actually deteriorating. So I think that's part of it too, is reclaiming the archive, and that's a project that a lot of young people are really interested in. And so, you can't, in a way, it's like, you can't fault young folks for not being able to know that history when they can't even tap into it. You know what I'm saying? Where is that stuff? And I feel like there's people out there doing that work, and I think it's important for us to uplift and support that work, because that requires funding, that requires resources. But again, it requires the institutions, the academic institutions, to let go of the actual archives. Like, stop holding on to this stuff. Stop holding this history hostage. You know what I'm saying? Like, that's a form of reparations too. It's like you're holding people's stories, you know? And shout out to you, Sonya, for mentioning Zora Neale Hurston, because it's like Zora Neale Hurston was the first Black female filmmaker. Like, she was making films in the 1920s, and I think it's like that's not even acknowledged. Like, I say that to people, and people are like, "Oh, wait, what? Really?" You know, and part of that is, you know, my work with Ira and him really uncovering his story in the South, and that was part of it. It's like Zora Neale Hurston were telling these stories back then, but people don't even know that. You know what I'm saying? Like, where do you see those things? And then we wait for a Criterion, like a racist institution like Criterion, to release that. Like, no, that's not okay. You know, so you know, that's a part of the reparations process too. To me, is giving back that archive that doesn't belong to UCLA or who NYU. You know what I'm saying? That belongs to the people. And shout out to Third World, because they're doing that. Third World Newsreel is not messing around with that art. They have a deep archive too.
I mean, if we're going to go into Criterion, you know, what is it, out of 100 films, right? They acknowledge four films that were made by Black directors, one made by a Latinx director based here in the United States. You know, so we know that our work is not going to be valued or seen within the mainstream canon. So the responsibility, of course, falls on us. But that is a responsibility we should carry with pride. And I think you're right. And you know, there's an anger, you know, just like, you know, people's, you know, art is locked, you know, and embodied pieces of history are locked behind museum walls. You know, our archive, our visual archive is locked in university walls, I think. And I think, you know, it's hard not to feel really angry about that and consider that as being part of this transformative moment that need to get it back. Anyone else want to jump in there?
I just wanted to talk also about pedagogy and just how we share information between us as well, and the generosity of the ways that we do that too feels really important. So some of the most radical spaces I've been in recently have been spaces of pedagogy, where people have shared their knowledge, shared their research, shared their academic resources, right? Their access to libraries, their access to the archive. And I think that's really incredibly important. And I think that intergenerationally as well, the generosity with which we pass on knowledge is so deeply important. And for us not to shame another generation for not knowing things that have been withheld from them. And I think that, and us to let go of the shame of not knowing about ourselves as well, which stops us from going deeper into ourselves. I think that feels so urgent for us to be able to tell those truly liberatory stories, is to kind of not sit in the lack that is often kind of the space that we are allowed into, right? And I'm really thinking about Black women in academia right now, young Black women in academia especially, who are just so generous with their research and online. Twitter is this rich resource in a way that academia has never been accessible. So I think to understand where that generosity is coming from and how we can nurture it is feels really important as well with this.
I think that's really important, because I think, you know, that's an example of, you know, a case in which the values of the institution cut against the values that we want and the values that we want to promote, you know, so that the institution's values are, you know, your faculty's intellectual production belongs to them and you, or your archive belongs to you. And I think what, you know, we historically see Black scholars and artists doing and behaving is something different. Is that we're really up to a different project, and we really have, you know, a different sense of priorities. So yeah, I mean, I think, you know, I'm kind of obsessed with this archive question right now, because I think, you know, part of it is that it's privatized in universities. Part of it is privatized in straight up commercial enterprises. And either way, it's scattered and it's not visible as an archive, as a real historic backdrop and legacy for what we're all doing now. And I think that's a really important project.
I mean, we could talk an hour just about the concept of intellectual property and the ownership of intellectual property. I mean, we could go grab a beer and do that for 2 hours. And how evil, in many ways, that whole concept is, that we all are operating within and have to negotiate just for our own economic, survival. We're protective of even what we create for our own economic survival, and how that feeds a capitalist system that commodifies all of our work, our stories, our histories, and how, again, that question of how do we divest from all of these structures that work against our values on a very core level? How do we begin to do that divestment work, even as we are navigating careers and needing to pay the light bill and needing to put our kids in schools? Like, we have very material needs that require us to play within an economic system that runs against our core values. And so how do we begin that divestment work is really a real serious question. But I want to talk a little bit about, since you all kind of started this conversation about how so many of us come into this work from non-traditional spaces, that film schools are not the funnel by and large for filmmakers of color, at least not in North America, and that many artists are coming into nonfiction film from political spaces, from electoral politics, from social justice organizing, from place-based, media collectives, from the art world, club scenes, right? And in these environments, oftentimes we are already working in some level of solidarity with one another. Oftentimes these are communities of color. We are organizing alongside each other. We're making art. We're partying together. We're, who knows, making sweet love. Who knows what we're doing? But we're engaging one another. And so, there's, in many ways, there is, for many of us, a real built-in affinity with one another across communities of color. And yet we step into this field where our identities are balkanized, where we often feel like we are pitted against one another. There can be one of each, one color from the crayon box gets chosen. We need a Native person, we need a Black person, we need a South. Okay, we got it. That's it. You're representing a community and we're good. And so then we are jockeying oftentimes against one another for this slice of what is perceived to be a very narrow pie. And so I think about, all of these questions, how do we resist the capitalist impulse to look out for our own, the capitalist impulse to try to get an edge into an industry, and work against the solidarity with other folks of color? How do we embed an ethos of solidarity into our filmmaking practice, into our storylines? I think that's in many ways the work ahead of us. I'd love to hear what you think about that, Ben Alex.
Oh, that's my question. Hello.
It is your question, dear.
Hey, so yes, I just wanted to say that I too am, honored to be on, traditional Las Vegas Paiute land, and I just had to do my land acknowledgement, and also to acknowledge those who have, brought me into the nonfiction field and given me a platform, which primarily have been Black women, with Firelight and Roddy Taylor at Concordia, and just moved and excited to be here and talk a little bit about just what's the landscape that's changing, and maybe pivot a little bit in terms of framing this in terms of what's exciting and hopeful about solidarity and the movement going forward. History is complex and it's dirty and ugly, and we only remember the things about history that make us feel safe and good inside. Unfortunately, the majority of Indigenous people's history in the United States, it does not come from that place of luxury. We do not have anything good to say about the last 500 years when it comes to the way that we've been, our land has been stolen, and the way that the stereotypical way in which we've been interpreted through pop culture. And so the disadvantage that indigenous people come from, like me growing up on the reservation, not really seeing myself, being poor and just not knowing how to get out of those, reservations where the big lights in the bright city is showing me a different world. Early on, I was influenced by an old Tommy Boy record that I got for a birthday present, and it was Globe and the Whiz Kids. And the lines of that, were, he starts to line up all the music. He goes punk, rock, new wave and soul, pop music, salsa, rock and roll, calypso, reggae, rhythm and blues, and master mixes, number one, and it goes on and on about all the different diversity in music that the DJ brings together. And I was like, that's how the drum works in our culture. The drum that unifies us, the drum that goes through our ancestors, the audio waves that we each carry with our own dance and our own rhythms. And I've found that my relationship in pop culture has come through unifying with other types of music and culture. And that is the breaking bread that I've had and I've been able to enjoy throughout my life, and never stray too far from pop culture and music and art being something that may not be on a platform at any given time, but does bring us together to become those funnels of new change. And now I'm very, very interested and focused solely on nonfiction work as the direction for which I think that we can continue to carry the spirit of the drum through all of us, through one heart. This is actually a small film festival in Spokane, Washington, where I was born, and where I'm working with them to continually make these smaller efforts to bring forward the spirit of the drum wherever we go. And I think that that's what BlackStar brings to the table, in the energy of what Firelight's doing for us. And then just, all of the different endeavors that you're all working on. I think we're all talking about the unification together through art and film. And the change will come. The change will come, but it's difficult. It brings to mind a well-respected indigenous writer, named Thomas King. And, he says, essentially, stories are all that we are. That's literally our being. As we travel through this universe, we are the stories that we put forward. So bringing those messages to the youth and drawing from the elders and centering ourselves around the work that we have in front of us, which will be hard, but in 100 years, I'll be resting, and I don't worry about that. So I always have drive and energy to connect with other spirits in this journey. I think about nonfiction film and just the direction of indigeneity in particular. We've had a strange relationship with both Hollywood and the film festival circuit. I think that, we've always been somebody's Indian. We've always had to fit into a certain category that, because the history of indigeneity is so gross, that we the films that have become this kind of our own tribal film history tend to have to explain. We have to explain ourselves, or we have to let you know that it's good, that we're okay, that our culture is still intact, that we'll continue on despite all the challenges. And I think that that's not the reality of the youth and what we're fighting for today in these movements. What we're saying is Black Lives Matter. What we're saying is we want our land back, that we want the sacred Black Hills back. The Lakota people have which is my father's tribe, turned down $1 billion because they simply just want to have the land back for the people. So we're talking about intangibles of culture. We're talking about things that money cannot buy, that white supremacy doesn't have their pulse on, but yet every over 60-year-old, white man, as my great friend Heather Ray says, is always looking to find a way to enrich their spirituality through the stories for which we can give to them to make them feel safe about their journey into the next life. I think there's a lot of guilt, and Native people are born out of this guilt that was perpetuated by the Catholic boarding school era. So I have guilt. I walk around and I always feel guilty, and I know that it's just from this history, this historical baggage that we're carrying. They sometimes say it's DNA trauma, and I don't want to say that I'm built specifically of that DNA trauma, but I know we're all struggling, and these are scary times. These are very difficult times. But the unification of us like this, just coming together for a moment to talk about film and what we can do, what we're excited about for our futures, brings me hope, and it allows me to feel like I do still have a place in this continuing journey. And so for me, my message is of inspiration. Like, what is it that we bring from each of our respective communities to bring that drum and that fire so that we can all gather back again and just and have a moment of clarity in order to shape, whether it be shaping out the atypical histories of our movements, or some of the the complex issues that we have to explain. None of this is going to get done if we're going to continue to play the game of the institutions that want to see that we're just okay, because we're not okay. And that's the one thing that I don't feel like I can say. That was like everything I was going to say in 10 minutes and like 2.
I mean, I thank you for that, Ben Alex. And I think, I think we have to create space to talk about the pain. And I also think, we have to talk about what brings us joy and what makes us hopeful. I think this unification of the heartbeat that we all carry, right? The spirit of the drum, which lives in all of our cultures, is what unifies us. And that's the place where that's the source of our power. That's the source, that's our driving source. That's our ancestral power. And I think leaning into that is what is going to get us through this moment. And seeing it in one another is what's going to get us through this moment. So I appreciate that offering you just gave to us, Ben Alex. In 2 minutes, as you said. And I just want to thank you all. I know we're coming at time, but I just want to thank you all, not only, for who you are and what you do, but how you all are showing up in this moment. We're trying to take care of ourselves personally and also do a lot of heavy lifting in this moment. And I know it is hard for all of us to put on our our armor in the midst of trying to take care of our hearts. So I just appreciate what you all are doing in this moment. I hope you're taking time to take care of your hearts, to take care of your bodies, to take care of your children if you have them, your elders if they're still with us, and just to stay connected to one another and to lean on one another and to see each other in this moment of struggle and transformation as allies and supporters and brothers and sisters. So I appreciate you all. I appreciate BlackStar for creating this space for us to connect and talk, and I hope that we can continue these conversations. I want to thank you, Marcia, Bhawin, Jemma, Ben Alex. Mwah. Thank you.